there were very high expectations towards what China was able to offer. They did not really translate into tangible results on the ground.
In what ways is China's influence in Poland most apparent?
To put it very simply, I think that there are at least three dimensions of China's influence in Poland: political, economic, and people to people. And the economic dimension, I think, is the one that usually, appears quite high in the media, on the headlines. And it's about, on the one hand, the willingness of the Polish consecutive governments to attract Chinese investment and to perceive China as a very attractive economic partner. But also it's about China being quite proactive in the past decade, trying to attract Poland, but also other Central and Eastern European countries to join Beijing-led initiatives such as the 16+1 platform, which is not very active anymore, but it used to be perceived as China's so-called Trojan horse of European unity. So for many years, China has been trying to portray itself as an alternative to Western European partners, an economic source of foreign investment, but also in the political dimension, which is maybe a little bit less evident than the economic dimension of influence. China has been very skillful in trying to portray itself as this neutral actor, a country that is only interested in very quote unquote pragmatic cooperation without that many political strings attached. And this narrative, it used to be quite attractive to many among political elites in Poland, with a belief that, especially in the context of the post-2008 financial crisis, Beijing could somehow step in and, on the one hand, bring investment, but also become this alternative pole of attraction to leaders that have become increasingly populist, but also in some cases nationalist. It's quite similar to what happened in Hungary, with Viktor Orban also becoming very populist and seeing China as an alternative to Western European countries, or to a certain extent, even the U.S. So that's the political dimension of Chinese influence. But last but not least, there is the people-to-people cooperation. And that's about many different initiatives funded by Beijing, including cooperation between universities, for example, Confucius Institutes, but also a lot of scholarship programs, media cooperation between different civil society organizations, and overall these attempts to try to reach out to the public to soften China's image and to portray China as, a benevolent actor that is not really willing to interfere in local politics. But of course, the underlying interests were different, and they were very explicitly political. But in terms of the soft power outreach, China's growing footprint in Poland has been portrayed for many years as very benign and not really aiming to influence the local debate or sideline certain voices, or maybe amplify those which were more pro-Beijing in the local debate to shape the whole discourse on China-Poland relations.
What makes China an attractive partner for Poland?
I think that we should differentiate between what China was to Poland a decade ago and what it is now, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. Because the war in Ukraine was a game changer, and it continues to be a game-changing event for Polish security, but also the security of Europe as a whole. And China's involvement, you could say the tacit approval for the war and continued economic and diplomatic support for Russia, this behavior has heavily influenced the way Polish political elites, but also the broader public sees China. 10 years ago, I think there was a lot of naivety regarding Chinese offer. There were very high expectations towards what China was able to offer in terms of investment. Belt and Road Initiative was received very warmly. Poland and China also signed firstly, as early as in 2011, strategic cooperation agreement. And then this was elevated to comprehensive strategic partnership in 2016 when Xi Jinping visited Poland. But the fact that these political signs of optimism were out there, they did not really translate into tangible results on the ground. And at the same time, the international environment changed with Donald Trump being elected as the US president, and then the Sino-American rivalry accelerating. But also the pandemic was yet another element kind of influencing local Polish political elites to reconsider the role of China as an allegedly neutral actor or responsible player. So that is also why I think we could turn this question around and ask why China is not an attractive partner to Poland anymore. It's been a long journey of realizing that many of the assumptions about cooperation with China, they might not have been true from the very beginning. So China was not really ready to invest in Poland as much as the local elites might have wanted to. But also China was not very knowledgeable when it comes to the local context. China was not very conscious about the implications of, for example, very difficult history between Russia and Poland and how it now affects Poland's considerations and Poland's assessment of China's approval for the war in Ukraine, de facto approval of the war in Ukraine. So all these elements point towards a very deep rethink going on in Poland regarding the attractiveness of China as a partner. And definitely there are still people who believe that economic cooperation is a must, and we're not talking about decoupling. Yes, there are some discussions about de-risking in line with, a trend that is all over Europe. But I think that there's just much less political appetite for truly strategic cooperation with China because there is a mismatch in long-term strategic interests between Beijing and Warsaw, especially regarding cooperation with Russia, between China and Russia, and then how Poland sees it as a threat to its own interests and its own security via the war in Ukraine.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Poland?
I think that if you look at the general public, there is a lot of simplistic opinions about China, and people are not that much interested in understanding the way China operates or what kind of interest it has. I'm afraid that quite unfortunately, China is still seen as a faraway country that does not have a real impact on the ground in Poland. But I think that if you look at the data, and we have access to some data, for example, some recent surveys, they all suggest that overall people are becoming much more skeptical towards Beijing. And that's not only about Beijing's politics, but it's also related to the way people started to look at China during the pandemic. But if you look at the political elites, I think that in the context of the war in Ukraine and how China has been very consistent in endorsing Russian talking points and the Russian perspective and legitimizing it on the international arena, it has also translated into growing skepticism among political elites, both on the left and on the right. And currently, the only political force that is openly talking about the importance of returning to business as usual in cooperation with China is the alt-right, the far right, and people who are also visibly pro-Russian in some cases. And this is, a political force that is not very popular in Poland. It's on the margins. Potentially, China could become a part of the electoral debate in Poland, but it hasn't.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Poland relationship?
If you consider Poland as a country that has been very much at the forefront of supporting Ukraine, and then you look at the way the political debate in some circles in the US has been also developing, with the argument being that, Washington cannot support NATO's eastern flank without an end, because sooner or later, more focus must be shifted to the Indo-Pacific. This kind of arguments, they don't really gain a lot of sympathy in Poland, as you can imagine. So in the context of what's going on in the American political debate, and then security-wise on NATO's eastern flank and on the Indo-Pacific with Taiwan, or the general kind of rise of tensions on the Indo-Pacific, I think it's crucial for the public in America to understand that a choice between NATO's eastern flank and the Indo-Pacific is kind of a false choice. So if the US does not support Ukraine and focuses only on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific, we will probably end up in a situation with Russia being more emboldened to test the strength of Europe. And Poland is playing quite a crucial part in this regard. So I think that Poland-China relations at this point, because of the importance of the war in Ukraine, have undergone a huge evolution. And because of that, I think Polish political elites are not naive anymore about China. But at the same time, I think that there's a growing awareness of the fact that the theaters of war on the Indo-Pacific and in Eastern Europe are kind of merging. And that's something that I think it's not really seen in the public debate, and it hasn't yet trickled down to the debate that is outside of the expert circles. And that's something that's important to remember, that, it's not only about America looking at Poland-China relations, but also about Poland looking at how the US security policy is shifting towards the Indo-Pacific and what kind of implications this can have for Europe, not only for Poland, but for Europe as a whole, for the EU and its security.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Poland?
So it's about being able to conceptualize supporting both NATO's eastern flank and American allies on the Indo-Pacific at the same time. Because, we live in a super interconnected world where decisions on the one side of Europe will also have effects on the resilience of places such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and on the credibility of the US. So I think that Washington has a lot of support among Polish political elites. People here are very much aware that the US is the only security guarantor for Poland in the current situation. But also there is a growing fear that because of the whole shift towards the Indo-Pacific and the upcoming elections in the US, the cost and benefit calculation in Washington might shift, and this could also be quite a problem for Polish security, but also European security.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Poland?
With the current level of tensions between the US and China, to talk about cooperation between the US and China to help Poland in any regard, it's a little bit detached from reality. We still have a couple of areas where cooperation between China and the US is possible, for example, climate change, but also we have to bear in mind that climate change as such should be problematized in the context of the Chinese long-term goals and interests. So yes, fighting climate change without China is impossible, but each country that is preparing or rolling out certain environmental policies is doing so also because of its own very specific national interest. And for China, it can be the so-called beautiful China strategy. It can be about actually working towards strengthening China's comparative advantages in certain technologies that will, on the one hand, help fight climate change, but on the other hand, it will also strengthen China's industrial capabilities. So it's not black and white. And for Poland, security is the most crucial thing. We have a war in Europe on our continent, and given how existential this threat is for us, we have to focus on the immediate effects and the immediate needs of Poland and other countries in this regard. China-Russia ties at this point are strategically close. There needs to be an understanding among the public that China has been legitimizing Russian talking points and Russian perspective on the war. The US support and the US long-term ability to be a credible partner on NATO's eastern flank is crucial. So I think it's also about having some kind of lines of communication with China regarding the war and being very clear about the red lines in this regard. But also it's about not being very naive when it comes to the ability of Western leaders to actually pull China away from Russia, because I think that there are actually more things that bind them together rather than pull them apart.